Good morning. Well, I guess it's good afternoon now. If you don't know me, my name is Karen Walker, and it's always my great pleasure to introduce Ann Meredith from the University of Rochester to our Sunday seminar. This year, she's doing a three-part series examining how Christian concepts of hope developed in response to political power, persecution, and moral crisis. It seems appropriate.
Yeah.
For those of you who may be new to Ann's annual series here, I want you to know that she is the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Literature and Classics at the University of Rochester. Among others, her classes include Ancient Christianity, Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, Introduction to the New Testament, and Religion and Violence. So welcome, Ann. We are delighted, as always, to have you here.
Thank you, everybody, and for welcoming me, and thank you for welcoming my sister-in-law, Helen, who is in town. She's in town for the Super Bowl. My partner is from New England, but we still love them. So we're having a little bit of a party. We won't mention who it is. So when I was chatting with Karen, I always ask, well, when she was asking you or touching base with me back in the fall, and we were just commiserating about the state of the world, as we do, and just thinking about how history can provide us with ways of grappling with our present. So I decided to think about three moments and over the course in Christian history and over the course of the 3 weeks, talking about Christian resistance to the misuse of power and using Christianity in corrupting ways. And so the example that I'm going to be talking about today is one that I have talked about here before when I was pulling out my my presentations, and I did talk in 2012. So that was 14 years ago. 2012 talked about the book of Revelation. So some of you might remember some of that. And then, so talking about resistance, kind of endurance and resistance when you feel vulnerable and everything seems so overwhelming, what's the basics of just resisting? And then moving into the medieval period and talking about the development of the concept of prophetic responsibility and social critique, and, maybe upping our resistance to recognizing our responsibility. And then finally moving into the 21st century, talking specifically about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I misspelled it, but I didn't want to destroy any trees, my autocorrect, so I misspelled it, but on the week that I do it, I'll spell it correctly. And actual activism and his concept of costly grace. And how do we, who might not be actively suffering under current systems of injustice, nevertheless, how do we stand side by side with those who are engaged in injustice, even if it might cost us, right? He talks a lot about cheap grace and costly grace. So that's going to be the kind of arc. And so today I'm going to be talking about the book of Revelation. And I like talking about the book of Revelation, even though it's a very weird book that has been highly misused. But that's part of the reason why I like to talk about it and like to teach about it. And it's an odd book. If you just read it through, it's full of bizarre symbolism, seems bizarre, monstrous hybrid animals, talking altars, flying beasts. It's a very odd book. It also seems to be a book that seems, if you read it incorrectly, to be taking a lot of gleeful energy and joy from violence and from divine violence. And it's often been read that way, a kind of gleeful energy towards the destruction of your enemies. But that's fundamentally a misreading, but it's an easy book to misread. And people have always misread it. From the very beginning, people have misread the book and misunderstood the book. Starting right away, people did not want to include the book of Revelation in the New Testament when they were having debates and conversations about canonization. They did not want to include the book of the New Testament. And so you have Eusebius saying, many people have set aside and rejected the book, pronouncing it without sense or argument covered thickly and densely by a veil of obscurity. What is this book? What are these crazy visions? What is going on in this book? And others at that time also said people are misusing it. And I think people have always been misusing it, but people were misusing it even then. And even by the time you get to the period of the Reformation, and you have people like Luther and Calvin, and they're also saying, I don't get this book. I don't get the point of this book. I don't think that Christ is taught in this book. John Calvin didn't say that directly, but of all the commentaries that he wrote, the one book he doesn't write a commentary on is the book of Revelation. Now, maybe that's because it's at the end and he didn't get to it, but I think it's more likely that he had trouble thinking about how he could interpret it. But it's been misunderstood from the very beginning. In the 2nd century with Montanists, when you get to the medieval period with millennialists, when you get to the 19th century with the development of rapture theology and this idea that we're going to be raptured up out of the earth, out of God's creation, and the world's going to be destroyed, the world and all the enemies that are left there. That kind of, if anybody ever watched the Leftovers series, right, it takes that idea of people being raptured. And in the 1970s, Hal Lindsey, some of you might remember, like the late great Planet Earth. I can never use these references with my students. They are not, all my references are no good. And he wrote, although I grieve over the lost world that is headed towards catastrophe, the hope of rapture keeps me from despair. And so people have often thought about this book as a template for explaining how are Christians going to escape this world and the current and the existing creation created. We're going to be raptured away to another place, heaven, whatever you think, but we're going to be raptured away. We're going to escape from this world, and this world is going to be destroyed in cataclysmic, catastrophic violence. That's just a fundamental misreading of the book. So it's often been used as a way to say, well, we're going to escape from this. We righteous people, we're going to escape from this and the world is going to be destroyed. But that is not what this book is about. This book was written during a time of intense crisis and persecution. And it was a book telling people, how do you remain in the world? How do you bear witness to God's truth in the face of unimaginable oppression and exploitation? How do you live faithfully in that world when the powers that be are destroying it and destroying people around you? Okay, so that's just to tell you how people have been misreading the book. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think they're misreading it. It's because they don't understand the nature of the literature. Apocalyptic literature, there's one in Daniel. There's one in the Hebrew Bible, which is Daniel. There's one in the New Testament, which is the book of Revelation. But there's many others, many other Jewish apocalypses that are not in the that are not in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Many Christian ones that are not in the Bible either. Apocalypse of Paul, Apocalypse of Peter, Apocalypse of Elijah, Apocalypse of Abraham, Apocalypse of Ezra. So many of them. But what kind of literature is this? Well, it's very related to prophetic literature, but people misunderstood prophetic literature as well. Prophetic literature has two components. It has a social critique and then a prediction about what's going to happen. What has ended up happening is in the popular imagination and even in the Christian popular imagination, people have overly emphasized the prediction, the foretelling, that God's going to tell us what's going to happen in the future. But first of all, if you actually sit and read prophetic literature, of which apocalyptic literature is an intensification, if you actually read prophetic literature, 95% of it is the social critique. And then you get if you continue this way, this is what's going to happen to you. So people miss the nature of that literature, right? Prophets are not foretellers. They're social critics. They're poets. They're preachers. Their purpose is to tell the truth about the moral condition of their own society. Particularly, they want to tell the truth about people who are claiming to be God's people while exploiting others and using power to hoard wealth and to oppress people, which might sound familiar. And that, right? And so they talk a lot about false worship. But the false worship isn't like idolatry or you're doing it wrong. False worship is people who are technically worshiping God correctly, right? Technically, I'm going to church, I'm saying the right things, but they are existing and allowing and participating in a society that's unjust. And God does not accept the worship of such a society. He makes that very clear in the prophetic text. Now, the thing about the prophets, though, people like Isaiah and Jeremiah, is they had a lot of confidence that God was going to restore justice and, in normal time and normal history. What apocalyptic literature is, what you get in the Apocalypse of John, why it's not just a prophetic book, is apocalyptic literature starts to emerge in communities when the crisis becomes so intense, right? How many times have we said in the last couple of years where we're saying this is not normal, this is not normal, this is not normal, right? The crisis has become so intense that we no longer that the apocalypticist starts to traffic not in normal images, not in normal kind of things, but uses these powerful, overwhelming images to, in some way, express the extreme nature of the crisis, using extreme imagery to sort of capture the attention of people. So reform within ordinary political life starts to feel impossible to Christians in the first century, for example. And the imagination of justice delivered eventually starts to become more extreme. But part of the way that people have misread prophetic and apocalyptic literature, now we're moving into apocalyptic literature, number one, they focus too much on the prediction and not enough on the social critique. They misunderstand that. And in the case of apocalyptic literature, they take the images literally. So you have images of talking altars, 12-winged eagles, books that fly around, all kinds of crazy, monstrous beasts, dragons, flying women, right? You have all of these imagery and they start taking it literally and trying to, as if it's a kind of secret code. When it's not, these are just shared mythic images from the world of ancient Judaism and ancient Christianity that are used to communicate the extremity of the crisis that people are experiencing. So much of the problem is that people have misunderstood the nature of this literature. At the core of this literature, and so we see it in all apocalyptic literature, but so too in the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse of John, at the core of this literature is a visionary journey. And in this visionary journey, the hero of the apocalypse, so in our case, John, is shown a vision of everything that is corrupt and wrong and what's going on, and also a vision for restoration. But what people have, as I said, what people have done is they've misunderstood this vision of, for example, the four horses of the apocalypse or the vision of a cataclysmic kind of cosmic war. They've taken those images literally. They've taken those images literally, and that's a fundamental misreading. And I want to use what I think is a very apt comparison, which is Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. So this is exactly a kind of prophetic text. In A Christmas Carol, Scrooge is taken on a visionary journey of his life and what happened in the past, just like in apocalyptic text too, what's going on now and what his future will be. And his guide in the journey is his dead business partner, Jacob Marley, and he drags cash boxes and keys and padlocks and ledgers and chains and deeds and purses, right? Because it's all about his greed. So, and in the rest of the story, Scrooge has these visions and he has those visions, but he sees another vision. And that other vision, right? He sees all the terrible things that are happening, the terrible things that are going to happen to him. But he sees another vision. He's offered another vision of the Cratchit home, which is a place of warmth and of love and of community and of inclusion and of connection. And these contrasting visions serve their function, which is a wake-up call. They're not predictions, right? But they're wake-up calls. Scrooge is changed by these visions. And especially when he sees his own lonely grave. And he says, please let these visions only show the way things may be. Dickens understood the nature of the visionary journey. I'm just going to read a little bit from it. Quote, and the Spirit stood among us, among the graves and pointed down to one, and Scrooge advanced towards it trembling. Before I draw near to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only? Spirit, he cried, hear me. I am not the man I was, right? The visions worked on him. The critique has worked in him. I am not the man that I was. I will not be the man that I must have been, but for this. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Good Spirit, your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows that you have shown me by an altered life. That's what prophecy and that's what apocalyptic visionary journeys are doing. This is what's going to this is not what is going to happen. This is not locked in place. But if you continue in your path, right, this is going to be your terrible end. But you can change your ways, right? The hope is that you're going to change, that you're going to be transformed when you see the alternative of what is possible. So that's what's happening in the book of Revelation. He's going on a journey. He's had a visionary journey of these radical, crazy visions, but they're nevertheless revealing to him, right, the evil image of the evil future of the city of Babylon, or the new Jerusalem, this alternative vision of the future. It's a critique of the current situation. So it terrifies its hearers or its readers with the horrors of a potential painful future, right, for those who are not obeying God's laws and God's precepts. But he's saying we can change this, we can transform this. Right? We have a choice. This is not inevitable. This is not inevitable. So the vision's realism is, of course, to sort of wake you up and frighten you. But it's not a literal prediction for the future, right? It's to change lives. That's what it's trying to do. That's what prophets are trying to do. That's what visions are trying to do. Okay, so once we understand the nature of the literature, let's get a little handle on what's going on at this time. And before John starts in the book and he says, hey, I had this vision, and he's sending the vision as a letter. The whole book of Revelation is a letter, and he's sending it to a bunch of churches that live along the coast of Asia Minor. And he's sending it to them to let them know. And he has in chapters 2 and 3, he's kind of prefacing writing to them. And he's talking to each of the churches individually before he says, and I had my vision. And we get a lot of information about what's wrong with those communities when we read. There's internal conflict and then there's external conflict. So I'm going to start by talking just a wee bit about the internal conflict and the nature of that internal conflict. And then we'll focus more on the real point of the book, which is the external political problem that they're experiencing. So he's going to share with them this vision. And he's basically saying to these churches, these communities, he's basically saying, you need to hear these visions because you need to be shaken out of your complacency. And what is he complaining to them about? Number one, they faltered in their faith. He says, you've abandoned the love you had at first in 2:4, right? Initially, you were really fervent, you were really vibrant, they were really devoted to Christ. Things got hard, right? So, life interferes. So they abandoned that love, right? They sort of have fallen back. He says they're asleep in their faith. They're not really alive. All this terrible stuff that he's going to tell you about is going on, and you're asleep. You're not aware. You need to be woken up. You need to be woken up so that you can begin to engage in resistance. You've fallen into complacency, he says in chapter 3, verses 15, maybe due to living a comfortable life. He says, quote, you're neither cold nor hot. Would that you were cold or hot, not lukewarm. You say, well, I'm rich, I've prospered, I don't need anything, right? You're like, yeah, I get things are bad, but it's not affecting me. I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. You're aware, he then starts to criticize the fact that they're tolerating people who are misusing Christianity to exploit others. They're tolerating and not speaking up about the misuse of Christianity by people within these communities. So That is what's going on. He's critiquing them as complacent, they're lukewarm, they're self-satisfied, and they're not calling out the misuse of the teachings of Jesus by people who are misusing them in their communities. So that, to some extent, those notes to those communities is intended to convict them and for them to hear these visions now and realize what they're being called to. So first of all, that's a little critique that he's offering at the beginning. But the real context of the book is the violence that people are experiencing. And that violence is specific, but it's also a kind of global culture of violence. So what are the specifics that they're experiencing? Well, you're probably already aware, especially if you've been coming to hear me for 30 years or so, but you're probably aware, right, that the earliest Christians are persecuted. They're persecuted, they're being arrested, they're experiencing social ostracism. John is in exile. He's writing from a position of exile on an island off of the coast of Turkey. This Nero in the 60s, he uses Christians as a scapegoat and has them burnt alive as an entertainment on the grounds of his palace because he set the city on fire and he's trying to so that he could build a fancier palace, and so he wanted to clear out some poor housing, so he sets the city on fire and he's like, who can I blame? Right, so people look for scapegoats who are people who are culturally marginalized and say, oh, all of our problems are their fault. So he says all of our problems are Christians' fault. Let's get rid of them. So, but Christians are being killed sporadically. They're being arrested. They're experiencing family ostracism, social ostracism, right? So they're experiencing this kind of general tension. Another specific way in which they're experiencing problems and tension is the fact is all cultures, especially imperialistic, fascistic societies, require public displays of allegiance. We require public displays of allegiance, right? We teach kids to say pledge allegiance to the flag before sporting events later today, right? There will be the singing of the anthem and can we honor the flag, right? We require that. We also do not respond well when people resist what are the standard forms of allegiance, right? So the whole NFL, speaking of the NFL, right, when people were kneeling for the anthem and all that hullabaloo, or some kid in Iowa decides he doesn't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance and somehow that captures, becomes a rage bait for the national news or something like that. So we also require those. Everybody requires those. Well, Rome required those as well, basic statements of allegiance. But because religious and political allegiance are so deeply intertwined in the minds of the ancient Romans and in the minds of the ancient Christians, Christians can't do that. Well, from the minds that, right, the Romans don't like it, that there's this growing, increasing number of people who are refusing to pledge allegiance to Rome, right? Who are willing to participate in the public civic rituals of saying that they're loyal to Rome. And so they kill them, right? So there are other people who also won't do that, but Christians are the largest group who won't do that. And this is a capital crime. So we know that beginning, for example, in 112, we have letters between governors and emperors saying, what am I supposed to do with all these Christians? I don't even get what we're killing them for, but I can tell you that they're stubborn and they won't just pledge allegiance to the emperor. I don't know what's going on with them, but and so it's kind of a window into the fact that the Romans don't know what the content of Christian beliefs are. They're just mad that there's this new group in town that is, and people are refusing to engage in these basic acts of allegiance. So there's persecution, there's actual persecution. And John refers to it many times. He says, I share with you in the persecution. He refers to it many, many times. So those are some of the reasons why Christians are being persecuted. It says, some of you have been thrown into prison. There's a lot of praise for those who have patiently been enduring, tension, threats of arrest, threats of violence, because most of the time governments don't want to spend their resources, right, trying to get people. They want to frighten people so that they don't have to spend their resources, right? So there's a lot of violence in the rhetoric, et cetera. and people kind of have to endure that and not be afraid. Well, that's true in Rome. That's true now. So those are the specific things that are going on, that specifically there are Christians who are being arrested, but most people are not. Most people are not, right? If you look in the history of Christianity, maybe there were a few hundred people who were killed, and that's not nothing, right? But it's a few hundred people over the course of several centuries until you get to the 4th century. What really is the issue in the book of Revelation is not just, it is, but it's not just these specific actual acts of persecution, but the general violence of empire. The general violence of empire. That this is a violent society. So what do I mean by that? In the New Testament, there are 24 uses of the word conquer, which is from the Greek Nike, right? So victory, right? A victory, to conquer, to be victorious over, which is the Greek word Nike. And of the 24 uses of the word conquer, 17 of these in the book of Revelation. So that's what this book is about, right? It's exposing the Roman cult of power. That is what this text is about. Rome, not only are they actually engaged in imperial conquest, which they, through violence and through economic exploitation. This is how they are maintaining their power and hoarding wealth. Not only are they doing that, and so that's why you have the use of the word conquer or conquest or victory, but also they personify conquest into the goddess Nike, into victory, or Victoria in Latin and Nike Greek. And this is the goddess of military victory. And she's traditionally shown as depicted as a winged goddess. There's a very famous one in the Louvre if you go. And it's everywhere. It's on this image of victory, of conquest is everywhere. It is on coins. It is on statues. It is on monuments. It's on altars. It's on arches, right? You have this everywhere. Everywhere you are being shown signs of Rome's power. Rome, right? You want to do something. Rome is there. It's on your coins. It's on your streets. It's it's everywhere. And so this is an oppressive world. And one of the ways in which it's oppressive is not explicitly just through violence, although obviously that's clear. How do the Romans maintain power of their vast environment? Through violence, military violence, judicial violence, right? Counting people out as illegal and arresting them, right? Through judicial violence, through military violence, but also through economic exploitation. The economic exploitation that is required to maintain empire as results in the enslavement of thousands and thousands, millions of people in the Roman Empire, and also just the impoverishment of many people. In Rome, you have a massive amounts of wealth that's being hoarded by a very small amount of the population, and the vast majority of people are engaged in subsistence living. Well, so the economic exploitation. And what you see in the book of Revelation is a critique of this theology of violence and of victory and of conquest, and a critique of economic exploitation. I want to read to you from Revelations 18. On your handout, it's at the end, but I put most of the quotation there at the end if you want to see it. And this is just a small little part of it. But if you want to say, what is it when it actually gets to the critique, and what is going to be the moment of destruction or the moment of realization for this community? It's all about economics, that people have used. Merchants are singled out, merchants and tradesmen, people who are engaged in trade of luxury goods and in involving systems of economy so that they can hoard these goods. And so it says, and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn for her, since no one will buy their cargo anymore. This is in the future, right? But what's going on? It's also diagnosing what's going on. Cargoes of gold, silver, jewels, and pearls, fine linen, purple, and purple was considered a luxury fabric. So they'll just call it, you can't, there are even Roman laws earlier, luxury, like you can only wear so much purple because it was so expensive. So that's why it just says purple. You're like, purple. Jewels, fine linen, purple, silk and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, slaves, and human lives. Right? They are trafficking not only in goods, they are trafficking in people. They are trafficking in people. And the merchants of these wares who have gained wealth and who have all the power, and they are exploiting the economy, they're exploiting their power in order to hoard all this wealth, that they're even treating people as if they're commodities that to be bought and sold. It says even in that sentence in the Greek, it says, and even human souls, right? It's intended to, like, this is the worst thing that they're doing, that they're trafficking. And so to some extent, frankly, when you think about the Bible in a text that is so old, and the more things change, the more things stay the same, that people in power use violence to hoard wealth, to engage in economic exploitation, even to the point where they commodify other human beings that they just want to use for their own use. So it's not just the specifics of being in this text, the specifics of being targeted or singled out for actual persecution. The text is presenting a counter theology to victory, right? Victory and conquest is not God's message. That is not God's theology. Now, the misreading of this text is that Christians have just simply said, oh, it is about victory and it's about our victory. And our victory, we're going to do the same thing to you. And we're going to be just as violent and you're going to die, with the sting of the 50 scorpions for eternally and in a lake of fire. And that's part of our glee. And who hasn't indulged in such fantasies about our enemies, right? Who has not? That's a very human way of thinking about the text, but that is not what the text is about. The text is not taking the violence and the power of the enemy and using it for our own ends. That is not what we are called to do. So if you actually look at the text and continue thinking about what it's trying to say about this oppressive use of power and this oppressive use of economy, and you start actually looking at the Greek, this is one way in which knowing the Greek is extremely helpful for understanding the text, because translation sometimes hides subtlety. And there's lots of things that can be translated world in the Bible. And I've given you 3 examples. Gaia is the earth. You might have heard Gaia theology, that's big among the feminists and eco-theologians. Cosmos, that means the order and the universe. And then the oikumene is the human world, right? That's our word economy. Oikos means house. How are you running your house, right? That's what your economy is. How is it structured? And of course, we now use it just to mean our financial system. But there it means not only your financial system, but the whole ways in which you're running your house. And you see, for example, in Luke chapter 2, Caesar decrees that the whole oikumene has to have a census, right? Human economies in the birth story. These are human civilizations. God didn't create those. In the temptation stories, you know what you're going to have? Jesus, you can have control over all of the oikumene. He doesn't want that because that's not what God has created. God created the earth. God created the cosmos. We are the ones who are creating our human civilizations, right? An oikumene that is in Rome is not the oikumene of God. So the claim of creation is absent for the oikumene. God did not create the oppressive imperial kingdom of Rome, which is in fact destroying the earth and destroying the cosmos. A lot of contemporary apocalyptic fantasies, as I said, take the logic of Rome and just put a Christian guise on it, right? They are also fantasizing about, destroying their enemies, and they're imagining that they're going to be raptured away from Earth, and that they're going to be, and that the Earth is going to be destroyed in this cataclysmic, catastrophic battle. That's not going to happen. God created the earth. It's very explicit. God created the earth. What's going to be destroyed is the oppressive economy, the economy that is oppressing people. And so what you get in the book of Revelation is this two images. You have the evil city in which people hoard wealth. They use violence and threats of violence to control the population. It's a place of fear, of terror. But this is not an inverted story.
Running. I paused it for you.
Oh. I get it.
Okay, great. This is not a story about terror inflicted. It is a story about terror defeated. And so when you look at the images of Christ, if you look at the Christology, right, Christ is going to be the one who's going to help us defeat. And what is the image? It's not the lion, it's the slaughtered lamb. It's the slaughtered lamb. That's one of the images, the slaughtered lamb, right? Christ's sacrifice is what's going, that's the blood that has been shed so that we can endure this unjust economy, this unjust oikumene, this unjust society, because Christ has shed his blood for us. There's another main image of Christ, and it's a weird one, where Jesus is in a blood-soaked robe and he has a sword coming out of his mouth. Now, obviously, that's not meant to be taken literally, but nevertheless, you will see sometimes artistic representations of Jesus being all macho and leading this catastrophic, this cataclysmic apocalyptic army. And he's going to lead this army and he's going to have a sword. No. The blood on his gown is his own blood. The sword, what comes out of the mouth? Words. It's the testimony, the witness to Christ's message and to Christ's love that is going to be transformative. We're not going to just co-opt the violence and the oppression and the exploitation of the enemy and just use it for Christian purposes. That's not at all what's happening. And that's been a fundamental misreading of this text. Instead, we're going to bear witness to it. We're going to resist it. We're not going to be complacent as we wait for and we're going to work to transform this economy. So it says they have conquered him, Satan, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, right? It's the Lamb's blood that has been shed for us that is going to be transformative. Not that we've inflicted violence and caused blood of other people, but Christ's blood. We conquer through identification with the blood of Jesus, not through shedding the blood of others. So you also have a Christology that is not about being victorious through terror, but about defeating through Christ's sacrifice and through the witness. So when you then get this vision at the end of the book, and you see what is the biblical or the book of Revelation, what's their vision, which is like the alternative vision that Scrooge has seen, which is a vision of warmth and love and welcome and community. What kills me about the misreadings of this book is they seem to end before it gets to the end, which is what is this new city, right? Everybody's so caught up in the weird images and the violence. It's like, yes, but what about the beauty of the image of the transformed world? So first of all, the first thing you realize is we're not raptured out of this world. This is God's creation. God so loved the world, the earth, the Gaios, the cosmos, that he sent his only begotten son, right? We're not going to be raptured out of God's beautiful, majestic creation. God is going to be raptured down, right? It clearly says God is going to come down and dwell among human beings. And then it starts talking about what is this new city, right? It's not going to be about the violent city of Babylon, but what is this new city going to be like? Well, this new city, number one, God's throne is going to be at the center of it. And what's going to be flowing out of it? It's very reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, right? Or all these rivers, these life-giving rivers. And one thing that's clear, there's going to be no economic exploitation here. What are you going to get? It says on agoros. Agoros means silver, so it means on agoros, without silver, without payment. And you know what's going to be in this city without payment? Healing water. The streets are going to be lined with trees, with food for everyone, food for the taking. And the leaves of those trees, they're going to be medicine. Therapia is the Greek word, right? Our word therapy just comes from the Greek word healing, which is therapia. It's going to be healing for the world. So sustenance, food, water, shelter, healthcare, these are all free, right? The more things change, the more things stay the same. So first of all, there's that, right? There's going to be fear from want. No, you're not going to have fear of want in this region. Everything's going to be taken care of without silver, because this is not just a critique of violence. This is a critique of actual economies and how people use violence to hoard wealth and exploit people economically. The Bible has intense economic theologies, and this is one of them, that everything's going to be free. What else about this city? Well, number one, you'll notice there's no temple in this city because all of God's creation is a temple. Right? We don't need to have a special temple. We don't need to, right? In God's oikumene, in the created world and the cosmos and the Gaios is the same as God's economy, which it will be in this transformed world, right? Then we don't need to have a temple because the whole world is a temple. And then you know what? There's no gates. There's no borders. There's no boundaries. They're always open. Anyone and everyone is welcome. It's a scene of inclusion, of healing, of feeding, of warmth, of connection, of welcome. That we are all, that is the vision that is exactly intended to counter this vision of violence, this vision of the misuse of power to exploit people. So I feel like for so many years, people have misread the book of Revelation. And as a result, and now it's the favorite book of people for whom I don't particularly align myself, because they want to see, they're glorying in these visions of violence instead of realizing that's what's being defeated. They're just kind of thinking, oh, well, the reward for me for being a Christian is I'm going to be able to be violent towards everybody else. No. This is a book about violence defeated. So for many centuries, Christians have misread this book, right? They've misread it as a triumphant script in which God's people will one day dominate their enemies through divine violence. So they've read it as a blueprint for how Christian victory, a fantasy of retribution, a timetable for the end of the world. But that is a profound reversal of what this text is doing and was intended to be doing. And when we allow people to co-opt it, as they have for 2,000 years, then it doesn't become as vital a resource for us. But it is a wonderful resource for Christians trying to think about how to resist illegitimate power and exploitive economies. It's written to small, vulnerable communities living under empire that demands conformity, uses intimidation and force, binds everyday economic life to participation in its values. You know, we might be against how our economy is structured, but we have to buy food. We can't all go off grid, right? So but you are bound. Right. And so you're bound to this economic system. So that how can we figure out how to remain faithful politically, socially, and economically without being crushed ourselves? Right. That's the issue. So the world in Revelation describes one in which political power and economic exploitation are fused. The empire is not dangerous simply because it's violent. Right. And our world is not dangerous now simply because we're seeing a lot more actual violence. That is dangerous. But because it makes violence normal, profitable, business as usual, and therefore invisible. Right. I mean, to some extent, we are even though I don't like it, we are the benefit. One of the benefits of social media is that you can see what's going on. You don't have to always be there. We see how this violence has been woven into trade, into the misuse of worship, into demands for public loyalty, and with the requirements for daily survival, right? And so in one of the most haunting lines in the whole Bible, in my opinion, those with illegitimate power and money are going so far as to even exploit and use and buy and sell human lives. And we are seeing that in our own society right now. This is not abstract symbolism. right? These are not just symbols. Everybody's focusing on this, who's the 666? Well, in the 80s, we were all sure it was Ronald Wilson Reagan. I still stand by that, but who knows? But this is not that. It's a searing moral critique of a system that turns people into commodities and claims to be a prosperous society. And so what Revelation offers Christians is not a plan for taking power and giving what they've gotten, but offers you a way of seeing. It's meant to pull back the curtain. You think this is normal? This is violence. This is violence as extreme as the violence of monstrous beasts, monstrous dragons. This is violence as this peace maintained by threat is not peace. And so what we see then in this book then is a call to work ourselves, to endure, to see, to be clear in our moral clarity. At this point, the violence is so extreme for the people in the first century. The main counsel of the book of Revelation is patient endurance and witness. That is the first step. You have to endure, right? You can't capitulate to sorrow. You have to endure and you have to bear witness and you have to speak up. Speak up against the economy, this oikumene, speak up against the misuse of power, and in particular, speak up against the misuse, right? Don't be like the people who are complacent. Speak up against the misuse of the name of Christian to contribute to this corrupt economy. So the book of Revelation is a book that often is not in kind of mainline churches or progressive churches, not often in the lectionary, right? It's an odd, unusual book. And part of the reason for that is people have misread it and it's been co-opted by people who have fundamentally misunderstood the message. But I think that it's still so deeply relevant that this is a book that is speaking out against the misuse of power, how to resist the violence of an exploitive economy that sort of forces you, and you have to stand firm, you have to name, but you have to pull back that veil, see what's really going on, and be willing to speak the truth to power. While we work for the transformation of our world, at the very beginning of the gospel, we meet Jesus and John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is also an apocalypticist, as is Jesus, right? Jesus says the kingdom of God is at hand, right? It's coming at hand. The difference between John as a Jewish teacher, preacher, healer, apocalypticist who had his own movement, and Jesus is John goes out into the desert to wait. And Jesus says, no, we are called to transform the world. You need to work to transform the world here and now. You don't just wait, you do have to wait and endure, but God calls us to transform the world now, to work for that kingdom, to live even if it costs you, to live as if we're all living in and trying to transform and trying to work towards that wonderful transformative kingdom of God, that wonderful transformative New Jerusalem, in which all are welcome. Everyone is free from want, and everyone feels included and connected. Everyone feels the love of the Christmas home and the warmth of the fire of Bob Cratchit. That is the transformed world. And unlike other Jewish apocalypticists like John the Baptist, we're not going to just wait. We need to work to transform the world. So the book of Revelation is the first step of that. And then we'll see how these ideas develop further into notions of not just resistance and moral clarity, which is what this book is calling for, kind of patient endurance and resistance, but moving more towards a sense of responsibility and eventually a sense of action. Okay, that's it. That's all I have for you today. Now, other times I've taught about, people want to know, okay, but what do you think the 7 bowls are and all of that? So I can send you my handouts on that too. Yes.
Can you place this in like when it was written?
Yeah. So it is being written in probably the 80s or 90s, and this is a terrible time. This is a time in which, the Jesus movement is still kind of a Jewish movement at that point. It's spreading among non-Jews, but this is in the wake of the Jewish War, in which the Romans killed probably 500,000 Jews. They enslaved tens of thousands of Jews. If you ever go to Rome and there's the Arch of Titus that's there right in the Roman Forum. And what does it show? The triumph of the Romans conquering the Jews who are now being dragged along with slaves. And you can see all their treasury. You see the treasury of the menorah and all of that. So in general, they are, it's in the wake of that kind of Roman power. And this is a period of time in which, the Roman Empire is really reaching its peak, both in terms of its actual borders, in terms of its kind of totalist creed, in terms of enforcing its requirements for loyalty pledges. That happens under Domitian in the 90s, right? So that's what, and Christians are like, I don't want to pledge allegiance to Rome. I'm going to be a good citizen, but I don't want to engage in this, like these loyalty litmus tests. And then later in 112, that's where we get someone saying, hey, these guys aren't doing the loyalty litmus test. And it's like, okay, we'll give them a couple chances, but then kill them, right? If you're not showing loyalty. So that's kind of what's going on generally, as well as all this oppressive stuff about the economy. So it's written around the 80s and 90s.
So closer to the writing of the Gospels than I would have thought.
Oh, yes. Yeah, very much. But from a very different kind of world and grappling with different problems. We in this text, it's so funny, we have the Gospels, but if you read the text of the New Testament, Paul's letters, the book of Revelation, they're hardly talking about Jesus and his teachings or anything at all, right? They're kind of grappling with their real world problems. And now that we're part of this movement, do we, pledge allegiance to Rome? Where do we buy our food? Where do we buy our meat? How do we live? And they're, asking very practical questions in those letters. Any other questions or comments or anything on this? Yes, Anne.
So is this John that wrote the Revelation, the same John that wrote the fourth gospel?
Yeah, it's not. People thought that, so in antiquity, that was a big discussion. You can read the commentaries and they're like, well, wait a minute. And this is one reason why some people, Eusebius says, some people set it aside as being full of nonsense. But the other reason is they say, well, it has the same name, John, but it doesn't sound at all like the Gospel of John. Totally different language, totally different style of Greek. Just as an FYI, it's hard to explain, but we can tell that this is written by a non-native Greek speaker, probably somebody whose native language is Hebrew. Just like you can tell a translation. So I don't have the linguistic skills to tell that, but others do. And John is clearly written by a native Greek speaker. So just for those reasons, as well as many more technical reasons, it's not. But that was a big, huge discussion in antiquity, them trying to figure that out. But even in antiquity, they were like, but this seems very different. This is a very different theology, very different understanding. Because if you think about the theology of John, it's interesting. He says, I am in the world, but I'm not of the world. And Christians, you're in the world and you're not of the world. And you're supposed to, right? So it's a little bit different than the synoptic gospels that are like, well, you're in the world and you need to be doing things, right? And in John, it's sort of like you're just getting a moment of enlightenment. You realize I don't really belong in this exploitative oikumene, but you're not given a lot of ethical instructions in John about what to do. Give up everything you own, feed the poor, include people, all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of interesting, it's kind of an intellectual ideas rather than plans for action like you have in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's what you described kind of can fit right over the situation we have in our country at the moment.
Yeah.
So the question is, what can you do about it?
Yeah, well, that's why next week, responsibility and action. Yeah.
So, the first thing that people have to get in their mind, people have reactions to everything.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, individuals need to sit down and just describe what bothers them, of what's happening. And, I got this idea of people forming, committees of concern. Just get a bunch of people, or we work, and sit down, each write down, this happened. This is my feeling about what happened. So you get a whole bunch of those from a whole lot of people all across the country.
Yeah.
And you can then, you can have this common feeling that there's something wrong. And then you can figure out, after your next two lectures, what you can do.
Yeah, but this notion of a common feeling, right? I mean, I think that, you know, saying that common feeling is you know, we're also living in a time where people are having fewer social connections. People are feeling lonely. People are feeling more isolated. And so I think that people feel almost isolated in their fear and their confusion and what are matters of concern for them, right? Or it's before you can even share what's a matter of concern for you, it's been politicized in this, you know, ridiculous polarization of our country. So I think that is so on target because I think community is the answer to a lot of things. And I think that this vision of community where people feel welcomed, they feel that they don't feel afraid, they can share what they think and see that their ideas are shared with everybody else. I think we have so much more in common than with the people in power across the board, across the country, than with the people in power who are inflicting violence, economic violence, social violence, political violence, actual violence. You know, the people, hoi polloi, right? We all have much more in common. And if we would remind ourselves of that constantly. If you think about it, in our Constitution, I teach this because during the time of Jesus, there were laws in place trying to limit the number of unrelated men walking around together. Herod had rules about that because he was exploiting people economically and conscripting them for labor for his building projects, and people were grumbling. And I always point out to my students, like, we have enshrined in our Constitution the free right to assemble because the people in power don't want you to get together and talk to each other. Right? So that is a hallmark of a democratic society is we have the right to assemble, we have the right to get together. Right? Herod doesn't want peasant Jews walking around being like, this is baloney. Like, what's happening? You know, so because then you get together and you revolt. Right? That's why when the Babylonians conquer Israel, they put everybody into exile to scatter everybody so they can't get together and resist. So anything that brings people together in community is already, I think, an act of resistance against the powers that be, because you do communicate, you do realize how much you share and how much you think alike, and all the connections are there. And that is, they want people atomized and isolated and frightened and afraid. That's why, you know, in dictator societies, you don't have the free right to assemble.
Well, that's why if you form a committee, you get together with some other people.
Yeah.
And you feel less threatened.
Yeah.
To express yourself.
Exactly. And, you know, you feel heard and connected. You know, so much I think that people are feeling, you know, just snowballing, right? I mean, just already people were feeling, and then COVID happened, people get isolated, people are frightened. They stop viewing other people as human beings. And once you start viewing other people as human beings with fears and dreams and desires, just like you know, that's when polarization can work. If you're interested in thinking about the dynamics of polarization as it relates to religious discourse, it seems like the title is Toward a Theory of Anti-Semitism by Gavin Langmuir. And it's a great article. But really, he's using that as a hook to say, just generally, how does xenophobic discourse develop, right? So you could just say anti-immigrant, you know, and he talks specifically about, you know, he studied it cross-culturally and across time, specifically about how people in power, right? They want people to be atomized. They want them to be frightened. They don't want them to be together, don't want them to be talking. So that is a primary strategy. So your response to that of community, I think, is exactly the right response.
You know,
Yeah.
I was just thinking, it made me think a number of us in this room went to this conference a couple weeks ago on St. Simon's Island, and there were you know, over 650 participants from across the country in all denominations of Christianity. And I remember one of the speakers saying, we'll meet next year unless for some reason we're not able to. And I thought, well, why wouldn't we be?
Yeah.
Initial feeling, but now, you know, after hearing this talk,
Yes.
I'm like, yeah, because I can't think of a better place to have been the Saturday morning that we heard the news about Alex Cruddy being shot and killed, because it was in that assembly hall.
Yeah.
And to hear 650 people gasp simultaneously is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And so I would hope that we will assemble next year, but it never occurred to me until you were just talking just now that could our government prevent that?
Sure. Oh, good. I mean, at the U of R, they were trying to make it so students couldn't assemble back when when all the Palestinian stuff was happening. And we're like, what are you doing? You can't do that. Like trying to limit protests. I mean, people, even locally, people try to do that, or, extensive permitting, or, there's all sorts of ways that they can claim that they're still doing what the Constitution says, So, I mean, I'm not fear mongering in any way, but I think I'm hoping that the tide is somewhat turning, but there's so much repair that has to be done. And I don't mean actual repair to our institutions, et cetera, but to broken relationships, broken families, broken communities. This is part of the pain.
Yeah.
Obviously, at the forefront are those people who are being scapegoated in violence, in our community right now. Yes.
I have a question about the increasing influence of AI,
Yeah.
which is not, there's humans that
Yeah.
are, or analytics from humans that are choosing what's going into that.
Yeah.
Is there anything in your background from this point of view that's similar?
I mean,
Back in the
well,
day?
first of all, technology, right? People, if you look at the history of technology, people are always worried and anxious and concerned about any new technologies. That's always the case. That's the history of new technologies, right?
So what would be the new technology back
in those days?
biblical times?
What would be the new technology back in those days? I mean, because it would mostly be around buildings, technology for building or seafaring or things like that. But I would say, it would be interesting to look, for example, about scaremongering and things that emerged, for example, around the printing press in the 15th century, because the people is dissemination of information. And, before that, people aren't actually reading the Bible, right? First of all, that's at the same time when the printing press happens. That's when you also start getting the debates of saying, well, we want to translate the Bible into vernaculars. So people who know English can read it, people who know German can read it, because previously you had to know Hebrew, Greek, and Latin to read
Written
it.
language is something that was new in a way.
At the time of Jesus? I mean, the newest technology at the time of Jesus was actually.
People could read and write.
Yeah, 10%, 10%. And Christianity was, in fact, instrumental in developing language, literacy. And it always has been. It always has been an instrument because it's a book culture. So it's always been, so there was a huge leap in literacy in the 4th century when Christians started binding codices and having books and they started to be disseminated. And the emperor started to fund scriptoriums so that you could just be churning out Bibles, paying monks and scribes to copy Bibles. So that was happening in the 4th century. And then again, right, when you get the printing press, more Bibles. And so people have to learn how to read so that they can, right? Protestants were huge in advancing literacy because you didn't want to just hear about it from the priest, right? You need to, every priesthood of all believers, right? You needed to read the text and make decisions yourself. So that would be a way. And I think that you do see this anxiety, for example, among priests, that all of a sudden lay people are going to be reading the scriptures, or that like they're all very nervous about that. So I think there's always anxiety around technology. Right now at the U of R, there's all the computer science people who are like, great, let's use AI in our classrooms. And then all of us are being like, but I'm reading Shakespeare. I'm reading the Bible. I don't want to do that. So, but student work and it's hard. It's very hard. So I myself don't really know what to do with AI, and I'm just in the trenches trying to get students to write their own work. It's completely transformed. To some extent, I've tried to think like, okay, well, how could this transform so that we do different kinds of work in the classroom? And maybe, I don't know, but I don't know what to do. And I don't know how I think it adds to people's sense that things aren't real, that they can't trust, right? I think it's corrosive in that way.
Right.
Like, is this, somebody was showing me like these hyper cute, almost ideal. It was as if somebody said, create a super cute video of babies with puppies or something like, and that's what it was. And I was like, these are not real. I've seen these babies that age cannot interact with puppies like that. Like this, but it was impossible. Like, unless you knew and you've been around a zillion babies, you wouldn't know, right? And that's just a trivial example, but I was like, I don't want to look at a computer generated story of babies and it's corroding trust. It's corroding trust.
I guess that's why I brought it up, because a lot of people are thinking it's government or a particular group of people, but
It is.
We're really talking about, you're not considering that as the government or another group of people. It's just AI, but meanwhile, I think it could be.
Oh, they're collecting
As
data.
dangerous.
They're collecting. Well, for example, there's a huge thing, because it learns off of everything that we post, right? So some students in their cheating, and I've made the fatal error of agreeing to be on the board of academic committee students. Like, I don't want to see the dark side, but you got to help the community. So, of people uploading professors' materials. And it's like, well, I didn't give you the permission to use my materials. Like, that is considered to be a violation of intellectual property rights and things like that. So, but kids aren't, they're just desperate. They want to study for the exam. They need a grade, right? I mean, that they're not, being nefarious about it, but that's the point, is you don't realize, right? Empire is so big.
That's what, yeah.
Right? Empire is so big. And in a way, if you think about the book, it's trying to reveal, shaking you and just being like, here's monsters, angels, talking beasts, and all this sort of thing, but to pull back the veil, the curtain that is hiding and normalizing all of this violence, right? So AI, everyone's like, oh, it's so great, it's helping you do this. And I'm writing, I had to go to IT and say, could you turn off it? Like, now it's all just built into the MS. And it's like, I'm using a lot of weird words and a lot of weird names. It's constantly autocorrecting.
Yeah.
things. So that's not, Tertullian was not turtle. So, it's, and I'm like, I don't need your help. I don't need your help. But that's at that level. But I think at the deeper level that I think you're tapping into is the sense of who's running this? What are they using all this information for? And also, it's reducing this sense, deep fakes. What can I believe? Is that real? Is that true? And we don't need more things to corrode our trust in each other. I don't think we need.
Melania's running it, right?
Yeah.
I was just saying before, speaking of community, and maybe we'll wait for the third one.
Yeah.
My niece lives in Minneapolis.
Mhm.
I couldn't talk to her in the morning because she was driving her Hispanic future daughter-in-law to work, who has not driven herself in a car by herself for 2 months.
Yeah.
Because she's so afraid of being, because she looks
Yeah.
Hispanic, right? But she said the thing that's happening in Minneapolis in terms of neighborhoods
Yeah.
and communities, and they're
Yep.
really pulling together. It's
Yep.
like, we gotta,
Then that's how you do it,
We have to
right?
do
You
it.
stand together and you see, right? That is part, it's, people in position, right? Romans want Christians to feel isolated, afraid. You are the ones who are in the wrong. You don't realize that if you step out of line, we're going to crush you, right? It's, and we're going to take economic opportunities away from you, all sorts of things. But if the response is to stand in community, first of all, one of my other favorite books of the Bible that many people didn't want to include in the Bible is the book of Ecclesiastes. And he says, how do you live in a world where, in some ways we've been told the story that good people will be rewarded, the righteous will be rewarded, and the wicked will be punished. And that book basically says, don't be naive, look around, right? The race is not to the swift, right? Look around. And you know what his response to that is? Be in community. Right, build up your community, because he says, who can stand alone? It's cold, and it's cold to sleep alone against an enemy you can't stand. But 2 people, 3 people, a 4-fold cord, like more people you have in your community, the more people that maintain these connections, right? You can't break that. Your enemies can't break that. That is the strongest response. And you see that time and time again in the Bible, right? That the response is community in Ecclesiastes. In the very final vision is one of an open, inclusive, and community where everyone's needs are met without silver Everyone's welcomed. There's no gates. No, the whole world, all of God's creation is our temple. So.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, speaking of this community, are there any knitters or? Do you know what ice out, hats?
Yes, I'm waiting for my sister to knit me.
Yes, that's what I'm working on here is my ice out hat, and so, for $5, download the pattern, the money goes to immigration groups, and they've raised like, I don't know, $700,000 already, and try finding red yarn, in the stores.
Yeah, it's all taken, yeah.
Yeah, but so seriously, if you don't knit, find someone who does, pay the $5 along with your ball of red yarn. And because these hats are based on a pattern that the Scandinavians did, to be in community and to resist the German Nazis.
Yeah.
In World War II, so.
Well, and I think that this is a good example of, if you look at, for example, First Corinthians, which I'm teaching on Monday, so that's why it's fresh in my mind, and his whole discussion of gifts, right? Not everybody has it in them, has the gift to stand on the front lines, but you can knit hats, you can make food, you can include marginalized people in your community, invite them to your house. There's so many ways that you can use whatever gifts you have to build community, right? We don't all need to be standing on the front lines. We can drive our friends to work so they're not afraid, they're not alone, that they're not vulnerable, right? We can deliver groceries to people who don't feel safe in our community. There's so many ways that you can create community and resist that go off of your particular gifts.
I think that's a great way for us
Yes.
to end, because we would all love to talk to Ann forever, and that's a reason to come back next Sunday.
Thank you.